The morning she walked into my boatyard, I was elbow deep in the hull of a 1962 Chris craft that had spent the last decade rotting at a dock in Lunenburg, and I was trying to decide if the keel was worth saving or if the whole bottom needed to come off. Nova Scotia in October doesn't give you soft light or gentle breezes. It gives you cold salt air and flat gray sky and the kind of silence that makes you feel like the only person left in the province, which is why the sound of heels on gravel at 7 in the morning was so distinctly wrong. I didn't look up right away. People wandered into the yard sometimes. Tourists in summer, the occasional broker from Halifax, who wanted a quote on a restoration they'd already decided was too expensive. I was used to being inspected from a distance, evaluated, dismissed. But she didn't stop at a distance. I heard the footsteps come right up to the edge of the tarp I was working under, and then they stopped. I wiped my hands on a rag, ducked out, and stood. She was about my height in those heels, dark coat, hair tucked under it at the collar, like she'd driven here with the window cracked. She was holding a paper coffee cup from the Tim Hortons on Main Street, and she looked at me the way people look at a structural problem they've already decided they can solve. "Are you Seth Calloway?" she said. That wasn't how conversations in Lunenburg usually started. "Depends," I said. She didn't smile. "My name is Elspeth Vance. I need you to marry me before 5 o'clock tomorrow." I looked at her, then at the coffee in her hand, then back at her. "Before 5 o'clock," I said. "Tomorrow afternoon." "Yes." I put the rag down on the gunwale of the Chris craft and folded my arms. There are moments when your brain just sort of excuses itself from the room. This was one of those moments. "I restore boats," I said. "I don't know what you think I do. I know exactly what you do." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. Not a note, a printed document with my name on it, more than one page. "Your company is debt-free. You turned down a purchase offer from Vance Marine Holdings 14 months ago. You own your slip licenses and your equipment outright. You have no outside investors and no business partners whose arms can be twisted." She looked up from the page. "And you told my brother to go to hell when he offered to buy you out." I remembered that conversation. It had been brief. The man had shown up in a blazer in August, offered me a number that was insultingly reasonable for what I'd built, and seemed genuinely confused when I said no. "Your brother," I said slowly. "Fraser Vance." Yes, I'd looked Vance Marine up afterward, the way you do when someone tries to buy something you love. A Halifax-based marine holding company, third generation, the kind of business that had its name on sponsorship banners at every regatta on the East Coast. Their flagship asset was Vance Heritage Yards, a working historic boatyard in Dartmouth that their grandfather had built from nothing during the post-war years. 60 years old. Protected heritage status. The kind of place that looked like a postcard and employed 47 people and still built wooden boats by hand because that was what it had always done. I'd turned Fraser down, partly because I didn't want to work for a holding company, and partly because the math on his offer didn't add up. And things that don't add up usually mean someone's getting cheated eventually. "Why does your grandfather's will have anything to do with me?" I asked. She looked at me like she'd expected the question and had the answer ready before I finished asking it. "Because my grandfather believed that the yards should stay in the hands of someone with real skin in the game." His words. He built a clause into the trust that says controlling interest in Vance Heritage Yards passes to whichever family member can demonstrate what he called settled commitment. His version of that was marriage. Her jaw tightened slightly on the last word. "The clause activates at the annual trust review. Tomorrow at 5, and you're not married. I am not married, and your brother is Fraser, has been married for 6 years. His wife's family has money. His lawyers have been circling this clause for 2 years, waiting for it to trigger." She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. "If I walk into that meeting without a spouse on record, Fraser gets the yards, and Fraser will sell the historic division within 18 months because the land under it is worth more than the boats it builds." I looked at the Chris craft behind me, at the grain of the old wood, at the hours I'd already put into it. "Why me?" I said. "You could have found somebody in Halifax, somebody who already speaks that language." Elspeth's eyes were direct in a way that made the question feel smaller than it was. "Fraser already tried to buy you. You said no, that means you can't be purchased. That means you have something he doesn't know how to counter." She paused. "I need someone he can't reach. and I've spent the last 3 weeks looking. The salt air moved through the yard. Down at the slip, a rope knocked against a hull in the water. You've been researching me for 3 weeks, I said, since the clause became relevant, and I'm the best option you found. She didn't flinch. You're the only one I trust. You don't know me. I know you turned down money you probably could have used because you didn't like what came with it. That's more than I can say for most people in my life right now. That landed somewhere I hadn't expected. I didn't say anything for a moment. What exactly happens to the yards if Fraser gets them? I asked. Elspeth was quiet for a beat, the way people are quiet when the answer costs something to say out loud. The Heritage Division gets folded into his commercial operation. The hand-built program ends. The apprentices lose their placements. The old slipways get paved. She stopped. My grandfather taught me to caulk a seam in those yards when I was 7 years old. The smell of pine pitch still does something to me. I can't explain to anyone who didn't grow up around boats. Her voice didn't break, but it got very precise. I'm not going to let Fraser turn that place into a parking structure for his aluminum fleet. I believed her. Not because she was articulate, though she was, but because the last sentence had come from somewhere that wasn't a boardroom. I looked down at my hands, tar and varnish in the creases. The things that don't come out, no matter how long you scrub. What do I get? I said. Something in her posture shifted, very slightly. Like that was the question she'd prepared for and didn't mind answering. A legal arrangement, fair terms, full discretion, whatever's reasonable. I don't want money. She looked at me carefully. Then what? The truth, I said, all of it. If I walk into your family's business meeting as your husband, I want to know exactly what I'm walking into. Fraser? The board, the lawyers, the risks, no softening. Elspeth was quiet for long enough that I thought she was going to leave. Then she said, okay, just that. One word. But she meant it. I could tell she meant it. And that was the thing that moved me when nothing else had. I looked at her for another moment. And one more thing. What? Before we go anywhere near a courthouse, you come here. You see my yard, my boats, my crew. If you're going to put my name in a document that has your grandfather's trust attached to it, you should at least know what you're asking me to put on the line. She looked around the yard. At the tarps and the tools and the hull of the Chris craft with half its caulking stripped. At the hand-lettered sign above the workshop that said Calloway Marine Restoration and Paint, I'd touched up myself 2 summers ago. I came here hoping you'd say something like that, she said. That also sounds unhealthy. Something very small moved at the corner of her mouth. That's because you don't know my brother yet. I picked up my rag. Give me 20 minutes to tell my guys where I'm going. My foreman, a third-generation boat builder named Pete, who had known my father and had the opinions to match, took the news the way Pete took everything, without moving his face. He looked at Elspeth standing by the office door with her Tim's cup and her dark coat. Then he looked at me. You being sued, he said. No fired? No dead? Not yet. I pulled my jacket from the peg by the door. I might be getting married today. Pete looked at Elspeth again. She met his eyes without flinching. She in trouble? He said. Elspeth answered before I could. Yes. Pete nodded once, slowly, like that closed the matter. Then you should go, he said to me. The Chris craft will be here when you get back. Elspeth watched him walk back toward the slip and then looked at me. Whatever she'd been expecting, it wasn't that. Your world moves differently, she said quietly. Yeah, I said. We skip the part where we decide if the person's worth it. We got married at a Service Nova Scotia office in Bridgewater at 11:47 in the morning. Her lawyer was there. So was a notary who looked like he had seen stranger things but was choosing not to share. We answered questions, signed documents, and stood side by side while a justice of the peace with reading glasses and a matter-of-fact voice asked whether we understood the legal nature of what we were signing. Elspeth said, I do. I said, I understand. When the justice paused for the exchange of rings, Elspeth's hand went still. She looked at me sideways. I didn't arrange. I reached into the front pocket of my jacket. She looked down. A plain silver band sat in my palm. Old, slightly worn on the inner edge. My grandfather's, I said. He built the first boat I ever worked on. I've carried it since he died. Elspeth's face changed in a way she clearly hadn't planned on. Seth, it's just for the ceremony. I can take it back after. She lifted the ring from my palm with both hands like it weighed more than it did. When she put it on my finger, Her hands were steady. But just before she let go, she held on for half a second longer than she needed to. I noticed. I put the band her lawyer had thought to bring on her finger, and when my knuckle grazed her palm, she didn't pull away. By 1 in the afternoon, I was married to a woman I had met 4 hours earlier. By 4:15, we were walking into a boardroom on the 14th floor of a building in Halifax that looked out over the harbor toward Dartmouth, toward the exact waterline where Vance Heritage Yards had been operating since 1959. The room was all glass and gray carpet, and people who looked like they'd been waiting for this meeting longer than was polite. Fraser Vance was already there. He was younger than I'd expected, mid-30s, the kind of tan you get from a boat that someone else maintains. He saw me before he saw the ring. I could tell by the way his expression shifted in the wrong order. Elspeth. He stood up. I wasn't aware you were bringing someone. You weren't supposed to be, she said. His eyes moved to my hands. He was good at not reacting, almost good enough. The trust administrator, a careful woman named Dr. Isabel Fortin, who looked like she had read that document so many times she could recite it on 4 hours of sleep, called the meeting to order. Elspeth presented the marriage certificate, the same-day registration confirmation from Service Nova Scotia, and the notarized trust filings. Her lawyer spoke. Fraser's lawyer objected on grounds of timeline and intent. Dr. Fortin read quietly and did not look up for a long time. Then Fraser leaned back and looked at me. With respect, he said, you're a boat builder from Lunenburg. My sister married you this morning. I think we can all agree this is a transaction, not a marriage. Every face in the room tilted toward me. Elspeth's hand pressed flat against the table, not afraid, furious. I looked at Fraser and said, restoration contractor. There's a difference, but I wouldn't expect you to know that given what you plan to do to the Heritage Division. One of the board members made a sound that was not a cough. Fraser's expression went smooth in the way that meant he was recalculating. And what exactly did she offer you to be here? Nothing that would interest you, I said, because it wasn't for sale. The room was quiet. Dr. Fortin set down her reading glasses. She looked at Elspeth. The clause is satisfied, she said. Controlling interest remains with Ms. Vance. Fraser stood. This is not the end of this. Elspeth looked up at him. She didn't raise her, no, but today you lost. He left without speaking to anyone else. Men like that treat exits like statements. This one didn't say what he meant it to. After the room cleared, Elspeth and I ended up alone at the window overlooking the harbor. The late afternoon light was hitting the water at an angle that made it look like hammered copper. Neither of us said anything for a while. You didn't have to say that, she said eventually. About the Heritage Division. I meant it. I know. That's why I'm saying it. I looked at my hand, my grandfather's ring on my finger in a boardroom in Halifax. He would have found this very funny. I'll give it back, Elspeth said, following my gaze. The ring, whenever you want, tomorrow, I said. She looked at me when I said that, not at the ring. At me, and something passed between us that I didn't have a name for yet, but it wasn't business. Then her phone buzzed. She read the screen and went still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. Fraser already called a journalist, she said. She turned the phone toward me. A message from her lawyer. Anonymous tip to a Halifax media outlet claiming the marriage was expedient and fraudulent. Photographers expected at her building by evening. She shut the phone. For the first time all day, she looked trapped instead of controlled. My building has a concierge, she said. 2 of them. Fraser knows every person on that staff. If I go home tonight, he'll have photos of anyone who comes or goes by morning, and a story written around them by noon. I looked at the message again, then at the window, then at the yards across the water. How far is your place from here, I asked. And how far is Lunenburg? She looked at me. 1.5 hours, then pack a bag. Elspeth stared at me. I'm sorry, you needed a husband by tomorrow. Fine, but this only holds if it looks like something real. And something real means you're not sleeping in your building tonight while Fraser's people photograph the lobby. I held out my hand, not for anything specific. Just an offer. Come to Lunenburg. I have a spare room and a ceiling fan that makes a sound I've never been able to fix, and a coffee maker that predates your brother's company. It is not a penthouse. 3 full seconds passed. Then she laughed. A real one. Not the composed version she'd been using all day. Sudden and tired and slightly disbelieving, and it made her look completely different. Seth, she said. You are either the most practical man I have ever met, or you have absolutely no sense of self-preservation. My foreman says both. That was how Elspeth Vance ended up in my spare room in Lunenburg before midnight, standing in the kitchen with a weekend bag and a garment carrier, and the expression of a person who has won the day and is only now calculating what the day cost. She looked at the kitchen, at the cast iron pan on the stove, at the tide chart I had pinned to the corkboard by the window. It's small, she said. It's honest. She looked at me when I said that, not the way she'd looked at me in the boardroom. Quieter. The first week was not romantic. It was calls with lawyers, documents that needed countersignatures, Fraser's team filing a formal challenge with the trust on grounds of coercion, Elspeth working at my kitchen table with 2 laptops and a legal pad while I ate cereal standing at the counter because I'd given her the only chair with the good angle. She slept in the spare room. I slept fine, mostly, except the nights I lay awake, listening to the wind off the water. And thinking about the fact that a woman I'd known for 6 days was sleeping 8 feet away. And I already knew how she took her coffee, and that she hummed to herself when she was reading something difficult, and that she had looked at the Chris Craft one afternoon when she thought no one was watching and touched the hull the way you touch something you don't want to let go of. I noticed. She met my crew that first week. She remembered every name after one introduction. She watched Pete work a seam without saying anything for 20 minutes, and then asked a question about the pitch ratio that made him stop and look at her differently. She walked through the Vance Heritage Yards with me on Thursday. Officially, for the record, and I showed her which slipways were structurally compromised and which were worth fighting for. And she listened in the way that meant she was actually going to use what I said. I started to see her stop being the woman from the boardroom and become someone else. Someone who got paint on her sleeve and didn't mention it. Someone who argued with her lawyer on the phone in the driveway in a voice that left no room for interpretation, and then came back inside and quietly made us both tea. 8 weeks after the wedding, Fraser made his move. Emergency challenge to the trust, citing circumstantial evidence that the marriage had been arranged purely to satisfy the clause. His lawyers submitted a 40-page filing. Elspeth's lawyers submitted 60. I drove to Halifax with her on a Tuesday and sat in a meeting room while 2 sets of lawyers argued about what constituted a real marriage and whether intent could be retroactively assessed. Dr. Fortin asked to speak with us separately first. She took me to a small room and asked me, very directly, whether I intended to remain in this marriage beyond the period required by the clause. I thought about the tide chart, about the hull she'd touched, about the way she'd told me about her grandfather and the pine pitch, and I'd believed her before she finished the sentence. That depends, I said, on whether she keeps falling asleep at my kitchen table because she won't admit she's tired. Dr. Fortin looked at me for a long moment. Then she wrote something on her notepad and said, "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." When we were back in the main room, Fraser's lead lawyer said, "You expect this board to believe a woman of Ms. Vance's background has formed a genuine attachment to a boat builder from Lunenburg in under 2 months." Elspeth didn't look at him. She was looking at my hand, at my grandfather's ring which I was still wearing because I had never actually gotten around to giving it back. "I expect you to follow the trust," she said. "What I believe is not your concern." Dr. Fortin upheld the marriage. Fraser's challenge failed. Afterward, in the parking garage, Elspeth and I stood by my truck and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to say that. In there. About the kitchen table." I looked at her. I didn't make anything up. Her breath caught in a way she didn't try to cover. Then she stepped forward and kissed me. Not because anyone was watching. Not for the record. Because we were alone in a concrete parking garage, under fluorescent lights, and she wanted to. I kissed her back. Neither of us said anything about it on the drive back to Lunenburg. But when we got home, she didn't go to the spare room. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at me and said, "I think I'd like to stay for a while." How long is a while? She thought about it. Longer than the trust requires. 4 months after the wedding, Elspeth's lawyers filed the paperwork for the formal dissolution of the challenge. The yards were secured. The Heritage Division's funding was locked in for a decade. Fraser withdrew to his aluminum fleet and his regatta banners and his smiling LinkedIn posts about innovation and the future of marine industry. 5 months after that, Elspeth put a folder on the kitchen table one evening. She sat across from me with her hands around a mug and she said, "Annulment terms. Clean fare." I had them drawn up when the challenge cleared. She paused. "I wanted to give you the option, properly." I looked at the folder, at her hands around the mug, at my grandfather's ring still on my finger because I kept forgetting to take it off, or maybe I kept forgetting on purpose. I slid the folder back across the table. "No," I said. Elspeth went very still. "You asked me on the first day to tell you the truth," I said. "Here it is. I don't want to give back the ring, and I don't want you to go back to Halifax. And I know that's not what this was supposed to be, but it's what it is." She was quiet for long enough that I started to wonder if I'd miscalculated everything. Then she said very quietly, "I keep the tide chart." "What?" "If I stay. I keep the tide chart. I like knowing when the water changes." Something in my chest unclenched so fast it almost hurt. "You can have the whole corkboard." She laughed. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Not a boardroom handshake, just her hand. We got married properly the following spring. Small ceremony at the yards in Dartmouth, which Elspeth had quietly insisted on as a statement. 30 people, Pete, in his good flannel shirt, her lawyer, who had become something close to a friend, 2 of her colleagues, who had believed in her when Fraser's people were making it complicated to do so. The pine pitch smell was in the air because they'd just finished a new build in the main slip, and the wood was still green, and it smelled exactly like she'd said it would. When I put my grandfather's ring on for the ceremony, Elspeth looked at it the way she'd looked at it that first morning in the courthouse. Like something she hadn't expected to want to keep. This time, she didn't say she'd give it back. 2 years later, the Vance Heritage Yards had a 2-year wait list for hand-built restorations. Pete had taken on 4 apprentices. My company in Lunenburg had more work than I could manage alone, which was a good problem to have. Elspeth still corrected the grammar in my contract emails. I still couldn't fix the ceiling fan. She had a drawer in the kitchen for her things, which had grown from 1 drawer to 3, and she still fell asleep at the table, some nights with a legal pad under her cheek, and I still put a blanket over her, because she'd never admit she was tired. Sometimes people asked us how we met, and Elspeth would say, "I walked into his boatyard at 7 in the morning and told him I needed a husband by the end of the day." And then she'd look at me, and I'd say, "So I told her to pack a bag," and somehow every time that was exactly enough.